I don't venture along the Metropolitan line as much as I probably ought to, so I think it's time to remedy that with a trip to Chesham. Chesham is probably one of the least underground stations on the network, if you get my meaning. Here are some typical underground stations in central London, and here is Chesham. It looks straight out of the steam age, with its timber signal box, its single track and its water tower. Honestly, it looks more like a station on a heritage railway than a terminus on one of the world's most famous mass transit networks. It's not even in London. Is there a story behind it? You bet. Chesham opened in 1889, the only station on a branch off the Metropolitan Railway's main line. As I've mentioned before, the Metropolitan Railway considered itself a proper railway, not like those upstarts on the district. In fact, Edward Watkin, the company chairman at the time, is quoted as saying, "I do not intend to be satisfied if I live a few years without seeing the Metropolitan Railway the grand terminus for a new system of railways throughout England." It didn't quite work out that way in the end, but nevertheless this policy is why so much of the Metropolitan line feels so very not like an underground line. Watkins' policy was to push out as far as possible into the countryside during the 1880s and 90s, serving places like Harrow, Neasden, Ruislip, Wembley and Pinner. These days those are all suburbs of London, but back then they were separate towns and villages. The plan with the Chesham branch was to extend to somewhere around Tring, where it would connect with the London and North Western Railway and use that to get to Oxford. That plan collapsed due to the Metropolitan Railway falling out with the London and North Western Railway. Watkin had a, shall we say, forthright personality and was therefore not the most diplomatic when it came to dealing with other railway companies. Despite this plan failing, the Met were already authorised to go to Chesham, so it was decided that a short branch line would be making the best of a bad situation. But they weren't going to go all the way. They were going to build the station in Millfields outside of Chesham and leave it at that, with the possibility of extending further in the future, at some point, when they got around to it. The people of Chesham were disappointed at losing their promised connection to the wider world. For all Chesham was a rural town, it was an important one, with a market and several industries, and locals felt that they were missing out from not having a railway. Therefore they raised money by subscription to get the line extended. History does not record whether Watkin chuckled to himself and muttered the word suckers. Nevertheless, on the 8th of July, 1889, the new station opened with a grand ceremony, including a band, visiting dignitaries, and cheers of "Long live the Queen and Teddy Watkin." Can you imagine a transport official getting that kind of welcome today? Despite the line being something of an afterthought, the Metropolitan didn't treat it as such, at least at first. They entered into contracts with local bus operators to run services from the station to nearby villages. While the company encouraged suburban development in places like Wembley and Harrow, they seemed perfectly happy for Chesham to remain a rural market town. In fact, this quality was a key part of their publicity, a country village easily reached from the city. The Met advertised itself very heavily to middle and upper class travellers. City gents could use the line to get to the golf course or go fishing, or it could give them an easy way to get to their weekend cottage in the countryside. The company could even lay on horse boxes for riding and hunting parties. Meanwhile, competition was on the way in the form of the Great Central Railway. The Great Central Railway was actually another part of Edward Watkin's informal empire, designed to create a link from Manchester to London. It therefore used the Metropolitan's tracks to get into London, which was great, at first. But then Edward Watkin retired, and now Daddy was out of the picture, the two companies began to misbehave. Both were growing companies who didn't want to share a main line and got into some quite childish squabbles. Probably the worst being an instance when the Metropolitan signalman deliberately gave a slow goods train priority over the Great Central's Royal train. The Great Central struck a deal with the Great Western Railway, and fearing the loss of all that sweet Manchester revenue, the Metropolitan eventually agreed to behave themselves in 1906. This included letting the Great Central run into Chesham. That's not to say there was no longer any competition. The Great Central was a modern express line. Since the Metropolitan could no longer undertake dirty tricks, they had to take the radical step of providing a better service. This included running a Pullman dining service to Chesham for the aforementioned well-heeled passengers, something absolutely alien to the modern underground traveller. But for the ordinary passenger, things weren't so luxurious. Chesham, being less developed, wasn't as important to the Metropolitan as places like Amersham and Aylesbury. So services were infrequent and often used older, shabbier rolling stock. In 1933, the Metropolitan Railway was taken over by the London Underground, and a lot of this frippery had to go. Commuter traffic was the priority, and Frank Pick, the general manager, wasn't altogether on board with these weird little country branch lines they'd inherited. Some, like the line to Brill, were cut back. Chesham survived, but found itself in this strange and unwanted position. The Metropolitan didn't want to run it, so they handed trains over to the London and North Eastern Railway, who had taken over the Great Central in 1923. But the London and North Eastern didn't want the expense of the line itself, so insisted that the Metropolitan keep it. So the LNER supplied the engines, and the Met supplied the coaches, which looked increasingly old-fashioned as time went on. Services were run on a shuttle basis from Chalfont and Latimer. During the Second World War, the Pullman service was withdrawn. Also withdrawn was a plan to electrify the Chesham Line and all the other lines north of Rickmansworth. In fact, the Chesham Line was something of an anachronism compared to the rest of the Underground. Electrification wouldn't arrive until 1960. Fortunately for the elderly rolling stock, the Bluebell Railway in Sussex happened to be looking for a set of coaches at the time, which is what you've been looking at. But the problem was money, as it so often is. While the branch line to Chesham was useful to locals, it didn't generate much by way of fare money and was largely kept afloat by grants from the local authorities, from the Greater London Council, and from the Ministry of Transport. In the 1980s, it was discovered that bridges over which the line ran were in a rather dire condition. Both the Ministry of Transport and Buckinghamshire County Council threw their hands up and said this was ridiculous. They weren't going to keep paying for this nonsense. The County Council even suggested doing as Watkin had planned, replacing Chesham Station with one at Millfields. It was only a last-minute grant by the about-to-be-abolished Greater London Council in 1986 that saved the line from almost certain closure. In 2008, the shuttle service ended, replaced with a twice-hourly through service to London, which still runs to this day. These days, Chesham has many claims to fame. It's the station furthest north and furthest west. The distance between Chesham and Chalfont and Latimer is 3.89 miles, the furthest distance between any two consecutive stations on the network. It's the furthest from central London, 25 miles from Charing Cross. In fact, it does pretty well out of hikers seeking a walk in the countryside. It really hasn't changed all that much since the steam age. The goods yard is now a car park, and the old sidings have been removed. One of the old platform roads is now a garden. The steam age features that once marked it as an embarrassing afterthought on the tube map now give it a period charm. It's gone from outstanding in a bad way to outstanding in a very good way. Hello, I hope you enjoyed this anachronistic tale from the tube. If so, you may wish to extend yourself to the like button and perhaps subscribe for more like this. Thanks as ever to my wonderful donors on Ko-fi and Patreon. You are the public subscription to my inadequate branch line. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.